On the morning of March 14th, 1853, in a courthouse that smelled of damp wood and ink somewhere along the Mississippi corridor of Louisiana, a small, deliberate cruelty was carried out with the same calm attention a clerk gives to a ledger. A woman, 8 months with child, was sold for 12 coins. Not $12, not 12 pounds, but 12. The receipt for that transaction was later found, tucked behind plaster during a renovation in 1897, and for reasons the men who found it could not reconcile, it was resealed and buried again. On the back of that scrap of paper, someone had written in a hurried hand something that made silence seem like the only reasonable response. Tonight, we will read what they hid and follow the trail of consequences that stretched out from that courthouse step like a dark river. This was no accident of chaos. The sale was legal, witnessed by 7 signatures printed in careful ink, each a small, civilized ritual that made violence official. In 1853, St. Helena Parish was the kind of place where live oaks held Spanish moss like curtains, where sunlight was patient and rare, and where the economy measured itself in the bodies that worked the soil. Greensburg, the parish seat, gathered itself around a courthouse square, where law and custom reinforced each other with the solemnity of worship. On Saturdays, the courthouse steps became an auction block, furniture, livestock, land, and human beings passing hands with the same bureaucratic rhythm. In that world, the language of transactions blurred into the language of order. When officials signed, the world rearranged itself to match the ink. 3 men held the parish's tone that spring. Judge Amos Crenshaw, 62, had spent a lifetime shaping statutes so that property and the protection of property read like scripture. Duncan Fairholme, 47, scion of Bellamont Plantation, managed wealth the way a surgeon manages incisions, with precision and an absence of mercy. And Nathaniel Pewitt, 39, the recorder of deeds, carried a hunger for status that allowed him to translate promises into certificates and wrongs into paperwork. They converged on March 14th for the reason such men always converge, a problem that could be solved on paper. The woman whose life would be repriced was named Clara Ara. She had been born on a Virginia tobacco plantation roughly 23 years earlier. The approximation itself, a statement about the way enslaved people's lives were economized into estimates. At 15, she was sold south, separated from her family in a Richmond yard, where fair and foul fortunes were announced by hammers. Edmund Fairholme bought her then. When cholera took him in 1849, Clara Ara came with his estate into the hands of his son, Duncan. At Bellamont, she worked in the main house. She could read quietly, a forbidden skill. She had a way with numbers, and she carried a dignity that did not soften in the face of owner's contempt. When she became pregnant in October 1852, she did not speak the father's name. The house spoke it for her. The father was William Fairholme, Duncan's younger brother, a man who read forbidden pamphlets, who laughed when Duncan sharpened his cruelty into law, and who had the particular sin of feeling remorse. Their affair began as conversations in the overseer's cottage, then moved into something more forbidden. When the pregnancy showed, William did an unprecedented thing. He offered to buy Clara Ara's freedom. Duncan's answer was not merely refusal, it was theater. He would not allow love to make a mockery of property. To allow a brother to buy a woman who carried his child would be an admission that sentiment could override ownership, a dangerous precedent in a region built on such absolutes. So Duncan devised humiliation with legal polish. He arranged for Clara Ara to appear in a public sale scheduled for March 14th. Property seized for debts, an everyday transaction. but he set the reserve at 12 cents, a number meant to denote worthlessness, to say of a living person what owners sometimes whispered in private: discardable. In a market where price signals value, 12 cents would mark her as damaged, diseased, unfit for labor. No respectable planter would risk investment. Duncan's aim was not to sell her to a stranger, but to manufacture a tableau in which his brother would watch the degradation and feel the weight of consequence. The buyer he expected was Silas Guthrie, the overseer at Bellamont, a man whose cruelty was a tool of management and whose hands made the punishments that kept others quiet. On the night before the sale, William disappeared. Some whispered he fled north. Others said he drowned in the Mississippi. The truth was more humiliating and simple. William went to Judge Crenshaw and begged him to void the sale. The judge listened, and then, with the court's characteristic coolness, asked, "Did your brother sign the proper deed?" William admitted he had. The law, the judge replied, had been observed. Grief did not annul transaction. The next morning, the square filled with the ordinary business of trade. Nathaniel Pewitt read the lot from the steps with the flat cadence of one reciting a catalog. Female, age approximately 23 years, house-trained, literate, though such skill is of questionable value, currently with child. Minimum bid, 12 cents. A ripple of muttered disbelief ran through the crowd. The price was a flag. Something was wrong with the merchandise. Men who might have bid turned away. The economy of slavery treated low price as an infection. Silas Guthrie waited at the front, hat low, expression unreadable. Duncan expected Guthrie to step forward when the crowd thinned and make the transaction look like a favor. He had not accounted for the stranger. From the back of the gathered faces, a man rose. Tall, travel-worn, coat dusted from roads. He stood too straight to be a field hand and stared the crowd down with a kind of blunt steadiness that did not belong to the auction block. 12 cents, he called. A few heads turned in confusion. Nathaniel Pewitt, flummoxed by this unexpected variable, asked the man's name. Isaiah Mercer, he answered, and placed 12 copper pennies on the podium. The exchange unsettled the choreography Duncan had practiced. Guthrie could not bid without exposing himself. He had been instructed to acquire Clara Ara quietly. To bid too publicly would admit ownership of what Duncan intended to be hidden business. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Guthrie broke. 13 cents, the stranger countered. Bids climbed, a small, absurd war over a human being reduced to coin. At $10, the crowd's attention hardened into something like curiosity. When Pewitt called for a final time, Judge Crenshaw lifted a hand and the auction ended. Sold to Isaiah Mercer for $10. Clara Ara had stood to the side throughout, hands bound, belly clear under a thin dress. She watched the man who had paid for her. His face did not change when their eyes met, but she saw a recognition there that shivered through her like a winter wind. The deed was signed. The coins counted. The law had been satisfied. By noon, she was being led toward a waiting wagon. Duncan, who had watched through a courthouse window as his theater played out, stepped into the square and called the man by name, trying to place him, trying to understand this disruption to the script of his cruelty. Mercer answered with the soft, dangerous calm of someone who knew both the ledger and the ledger's consequences. "Business," he said. The word was polite and like a blade. As he lifted his hand to the rein and turned the wagon toward the road, Clara Ara's head filled with a dozen small, cold calculations. This stranger had outmaneuvered an overseer who served a master who had made cruelty a domestic art. He had arrived at the precise moment he needed to. He knew the price to place and the moment to bid. Either he was a providence in human form or he was part of something more terrible. A precisely set trap. Clara Ara could feel the shape of that thought like a shadow lengthening at dusk, and in the quiet between town and forest, she understood that law, custom, and the cruelty they legalized could hide something far worse than any single act of violence. Clara Ara did not trust the ease of things. Years of being measured against utility had trained her to read small mercies for the traps they often concealed. Mercer's story about Richmond, about the auction where Edmund Fairholme bought her, was true enough. The man who had placed 12 copper pennies on a courthouse podium remembered faces he had once seen. He produced a deed of manumission folded in his coat and handed it to her like a dangerous promise. He spoke of seeing a beating in New Orleans that unmoored him, of leaving the traders' wagons and working with abolitionists in Cincinnati. He told her William had come to them months earlier, had paid what he could, had asked for help arranging a passage north. He said he had agreed to steer Clara to safety, but when Mercer described the way Duncan had retooled the auction, the 12-cent reserve, the choice of witnesses, the expected hush of the overseer's purchase, Clara felt the same cold comprehension she had felt on the courthouse steps. Duncan did not make mistakes. He did not leave openings. If Duncan had wanted Clara Ara to become Guthrie's property, Guthrie would have had her. The perfect timing of Mercer's appearance, the precision of his bid, these could be fortune, or they could be evidence of a larger design. Either way, the arrangement did not promise mercy, it promised consequence. They camped that night in a small clearing where firelight would not be visible from the road. Mercer spoke without theatrics. He admitted Duncan knew of the escape. He admitted the auction had been rearranged to ensure Clara Ara would end up in Guthrie's hands if no one intervened. But he also confessed something else. There were options, dirty and precise and painful, that might yet spare her child. Duncan had offered him a choice, Mercer said. He could hand Clara Ara over in a way that would look like the plan had succeeded and the overseer had claimed his prize. Or he could take her north under the very eyes Duncan had set against them, where slave catchers waited with papers and force. If Mercer refused, he said, Duncan had promised to assign more brutal men to the job. The result, Mercer believed, would be far worse. This was a cruel calculus. Clara Ara held the small cloth package Bethy had pressed into her hands and felt the knife sewn into the hem of her dress like the last private syllable of a sentence that might end in mercy. She imagined killing Mercer in his sleep and then trying to run. She imagined the certain capture that would follow, the child ripped from her body, the sticks and collar that would break her. The knife was not escape. It was an act of ownership over her own death if nothing else could be claimed. Mercer offered something else: money, papers, and an alternative route. North was predictable. Duncan expected that. South, through forgotten roads to New Orleans, and then by ship to Mexico, was longer and more dangerous, but it offered the possibility of disappearing. To make it work, there had to be a diversion. Mercer had found a woman named Ruth Chambers in a small settlement 8 miles south, a woman already consumed by consumption, her days narrowed to a few shallow breaths. Ruth and her family could use money. Ruth could be made to resemble Clara Ara at a distance. Ruth, by dying at the right moment during an interception, could turn her death into a weapon that broke Duncan's design. Clara Ara's reaction was a mixture of horror and something else, a recognition of the terrible logic that binds desperate people. Ruth's plan was not romantic. It was arithmetic. A corpse is harder to interrogate than a living witness. A dead woman cannot be tortured into revealing a name or a route. If Ruth timed her death so that the men who intercepted the wagon faced a dying body instead of a captive, they would have no leverage to unmask deception. Duncan would be thwarted not by force, but by the finality of a human life chosen as currency. At dawn, they reached the settlement. It was the kind of place official records neglected, a collection of cabins centered on a well where people who lived between jurisdictions and beyond maps kept their daily economies. In the smallest of the cabins, Ruth lay on a bed that sagged like an old promise. Her skin had the hollow gray of lungs consumed from the inside. Her voice barely left her throat, but her eyes were clear enough to anchor Clara Ara's trembling. They stood a little apart from the bed, a dying woman and the girl who might walk away from her world forever. Ruth's words were spare. She would do it, she said. Her children would be provided for. She would time the end, so the men at the interception would find only a body, and their right to re-enslave would evaporate in the face of a dying woman's final station. "Names do not matter much where I am going," she told Clara Ara. "Remember me if it comforts you. Live so the child lives. Make it mean something." They did not talk long. The bargain was heavy and precise. Mercy in that moment felt like the theft of another person's life. But Clara Ara, who had a knife stitched into her dress and a deed of manumission folded like a promise, found herself accepting the terms because the alternative was smaller and darker. She embraced Ruth quietly, promised to remember, and stepped into a path that would take her south. Mercer stayed with Ruth. He arranged the swap. Ruth would be wrapped in Clara Ara's shawl and bonnet. A cloth bundle would create the silhouette of a pregnancy. They would travel north in the same wagon. When the men with papers intercepted them, they would find a sick woman who resembled the fugitive from a distance. While they argued, while Duncan's hirelings attempted to convert a corpse into evidence of escape, Clara Ara would slip south and vanish into the network Mercer had shaped with money and meticulous contingency. The morning they left the settlement, the sun was just a pale coin in a humid sky. Clara Ara moved down a path through scrub and pine with the leather pouch heavy at her hip and a bundle of clothes pressed to her chest. She followed Mercer's instructions. 3 miles to a road, west to a tavern called the Black Swan, a man named Marcus who would know the password dated on the paper. She did not look back. She could not bear the thought of Ruth propped in the wagon, pretending to be the embodiment of her freedom. At 2 in the afternoon, as the road ran deeper into pine and the wagon's wheels kicked up the dust of a place that likes to forget, 4 men on horseback appeared like the law made visible. They were the sort of men whose confidence had been earned by a lifetime of having the law on their side. Porter held papers. "Isaiah Mercer," he said. "We have a warrant for the return of fugitive property. A Negro woman named Clara Ara absconded from Bellamont." Mercer felt his paper, his deed. He offered them both with the calm he had practiced. Porter announced that Judge Crenshaw had voided the deed. The woman must be returned. Mercer pulled aside the wagon canvas. Ruth looked at the men with fever-bright eyes and answered with a whisper, "Gone. By your reach, beyond Duncan Fairholme's reach. She is free." The men were not convinced. They prodded and pulled. When the bonnet shifted, Ruth's face emerged, gaunt, fevered, a poor likeness at best of the woman they sought. "She looks wrong," Porter said. Mercer insisted she had caught consumption and that she was the woman he had purchased. They searched the wagon with the impatience of men unaccustomed to mistakes and the certainty that the world owed them clarity. they found nothing. Then Ruth spoke. Her words were meant for Porter, but carried into the small, exposed air of that crossroad. She said she was gone. She said she would never tell. She said, with a clarity that made the men pause, that she had taken control of her ending so her death could become a weapon. Blood came to her lips. Foam gathered. Men with rifles and hired warrants looked on while a woman they had assumed was property turned her last breath into a refusal. Porter had a choice. He could seize the body, drag it back like evidence, and face the legal and moral consequences of what would happen if questions were asked. He could kill Mercer on the road and risk indictments and papers and inconvenient witnesses. He could report the interception and the woman's death and let the paperwork decide. In the end, he chose a bureaucratic detachment. They buried Ruth Chambers by the roadside in a shallow grave, unmarked, and returned to their master with a report shaped to protect themselves. They had intercepted the wagon. The woman had been unwell and died before they could question her. Nothing could be proved. The trail was cold. Mercer stood at the grave without the theatrics of grief. He spoke her name 3 times into the damp earth, a private litany for a woman who had calibrated the hour of her death so that it became a blow against a cruel design. Then he climbed into his wagon and continued north, as planned, to deliver a story that made legal sense and to leave behind a corpse whose death would become a silence the law could not turn into a conviction. When the men rode away and the ground settled over Ruth's body, the road reclaimed its ordinary purposes. The wagon's torn canvas, the scattered supplies, and the traces of human bargains were the sort of debris that history sometimes swallows whole. But a few faces remembered. James Ridley among them, a man who had once hunted runaways and whose hands knew how to pull people from the margins. That afternoon would find its way into other people's nights, into the uneasy dreams of men who had been party to organized cruelty. And yet, for the moment, the most formal structures, the judge, the recorder of deeds, the parish ledger, had nothing to convict. The law had taken its course. The law had been satisfied. The men went back to their lives, and a woman lay buried by the road. Mercer did what men in his position often did to shield themselves from suspicion. He filed paperwork. He went before Judge Crenshaw with the expression of a man rehearsing confusion. He claimed the woman he had purchased had fallen ill during travel. He said she died before the property could be delivered to safe territory. He sought compensation, a performative gesture he knew the judge would deny. And Crenshaw did deny it, citing the 12-cent minimum bid as implicit evidence that the seller had already acknowledged the property was damaged. The law folded itself neatly around the lie. Everything appeared regular, documented, and complete. Yet beneath that sterile veneer of signatures and denied claims, something else had already happened. Duncan's plan, engineered with an architect's precision, had collapsed beneath the weight of one dying woman's refusal. The machinery built to humiliate Clara, to destroy William's hope, to assert Duncan's dominion, had misfired. And though Duncan could sense it, though he likely tasted the sourness of the failure each time he looked at the empty space Clara had occupied in his control, he could prove nothing. The trap he'd crafted so meticulously had closed on air. Months passed. Duncan ordered searches. Notices appeared across Louisiana and beyond, inked with rewards that grew from hundreds into thousands. Slave catchers drifted through parishes whispering theories. Riders scanned river landings, but Clara did not reappear. Rivers swallowed truth easily in those years. Roads held footprints only until wind or hooves erased them. Whatever path she took, south to New Orleans, west to the unfamiliar borderlands, or hidden upriver among those who could vanish without written trace. None of Duncan's hired men found it. Others involved in that march found endings shaped by the same system they had once served. Judge Crenshaw died in 1861, just before secession. His life's work, the careful shepherding of laws that treated people as property, dissolved beneath the coming war, but he never lived to see the edifice crack. Duncan survived the conflict only to lose everything in its wake. Bellamont burned under Union torch. Margaret left him. He died in a mobile boarding house in 1872, alone, unseen. The legacy he had worshipped turned to dust. Guthrie, the overseer who believed cruelty was a tool of order, was found face down in a ditch in 1854 in water too shallow to drown an unconscious man. No inquiry pursued the matter. Puett, who had spoken Clara Ara's description in a flat courthouse cadence, disappeared when Union troops approached in 1863. He left no forwarding address, no footnote in local memory. Only scraps survived, fragments that flickered faintly through years of silence. James Ridley, who had stood among the men sent to intercept Mercer's wagon, carried the memory of Ruth's death like a stone in his chest. 15 years later, in 1868, he sought a Methodist minister and confessed to the things he had done in his working years. The captures, the beatings he enabled, the families separated because of signatures he executed. But nothing haunted him like that March afternoon. He told Reverend Hargrove about Ruth's last breath, the blood on her lips, the defiance in eyes that should have been dulled by suffering. "I have chased more than 200 souls," he said, "and never seen one choose death so deliberately, not to escape, but to ruin the machinery itself." Hargrove wrote down the confession in longhand. Perhaps he believed documentation was enough, but he did not publish it. When Hargrove died in 1902, his daughter Sarah discovered the confession amid his papers. The truth within it was unsettling. Not only that such cruelty had occurred, but that her father had held it quietly for decades. She chose differently. In 1931, she submitted the confession to a small abolitionist journal. Few read it, but she placed it where silence could no longer cover it entirely. Because some stories demand witnesses even a century too late. The hidden receipt found in 1897, sealed first by clerks who feared its content, sealed again by historians who recognized its implications, resurfaced once more in 1998. This time it was kept, cataloged, and placed in archives. The deed named no woman, but on its back, in handwriting now cracked and brown at the edges, was William Fairholme's message. The greatest evil is not what wicked men do, but what good men allow. He called himself a coward. Perhaps he was, or perhaps courage arrives too late for most men, and the best they can do is leave behind a warning for someone braver. What became of Clara Ara after the southern roads carried her beyond Ruth's sacrifice remains a study in conjecture. Some historians believe she reached Mexico, perhaps Veracruz, where communities of escaped enslaved people built lives that defied the nation that had tried to own them. Others argue she fled to Haiti. A genealogist once traced a Clara Freeman in an 1870 Illinois census, a woman of the right age with a mixed-race daughter born in 1853. The daughter's name on that record was Ruth. It is only a theory, a handful of circumstantial threads. But sometimes the smallest threads anchor an entire life. Maybe she made it. Maybe she lived to be old, telling her daughter stories about a land they would never return to. about a woman who bought their future with the quiet bravery of her last breath. Or maybe the journey caught her, in forest, or fever, or the hands of men who saw her only as a price. History leaves us with silences large enough to swallow truth. But those silences, too, speak. They tell us she slipped beyond the reach of the men who claimed her. They tell us she became untraceable, which is a kind of victory no archive can quantify. Perhaps that is the quietest justice her era allowed. The 12-cent sale, preserved on its brittle paper, stands as a symbol of the world that created it. A world where cruelty could be executed by clerks, ratified by benches, witnessed by men who later avoided the weight of memory. Not because the act was unusual, but because it was typical. Bureaucratic violence always seeks respectability. It wears the mask of order, of signatures, of fees properly collected. Every person involved made a choice. Duncan chose to turn law into spite. William chose hope too late for it to save him. Mercer chose to reassemble his broken conscience into a path for someone else's escape. Judge Crenshaw chose procedure over humanity. Ruth Chambers chose to shape her own death into a shield. And Clara Ara, she chose survival in a world designed to deny her even that. Choices written in ink, in blood, in silence. The 7 witnesses who signed the deed chose something too. They chose to look at a young pregnant woman and record a price beside her name, or rather, in place of her name. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren spent generations trying to bury what those signatures meant. But ink does not rot. Paper whispers when pulled from walls. Stories surface no matter how deeply buried. And this one reminds us that the cruelest instrument in that age was not the whip, nor the shackle, nor the field. It was the law, the quiet, polished weapon used by men who believed themselves moral because they had written their sins into procedure. What became of Clara Ara remains unresolved. But unresolved does not mean lost. It may mean she moved beyond the map, past the reach of men who had shaped her fate since childhood. Perhaps her absence from the record is the very proof of her freedom. What do you believe? Did she make it across the border of a world built to break her? Did she carry her child into a life unmarred by the violence that forged her? Or did Duncan's shadow reach farther than we imagine? Tell me what you think. And if these forgotten histories speak to something in you, the dread, the grief, the unresolved echoes, share this story, subscribe, and stay with us. There are more remnants waiting in the dark.